The new beginning. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over Oakdale Heights, illuminating the tidy rows of houses and lush, green lawns that stretched down each quiet street. The Parker family's new home stood proudly in the middle of Maple Street, its freshly painted facade and neat landscaping adding a touch of life to the otherwise sleepy suburban block. For Jason Parker, this house wasn't just a place to live. It was a symbol of years of sacrifice, hard work, and the promise of a fresh start. Jason, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, stood by the grill in his backyard, flipping burgers with a practiced ease that reflected his relaxed confidence. His wife, Lisa, a warm and vibrant woman with a quick smile and welcoming laugh, busied herself setting out trays of lemonade and snacks on the picnic table nearby. Their children, Zoe and Marcus, ran around the yard, squealing with joy as they chased each other with water balloons, their laughter filling the air. Today marked a significant day for the Parkers. It was their first weekend in their new home, and they had decided to host a barbecue to celebrate. The scent of sizzling ribs and charred vegetables wafted through the yard, mingling with the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint perfume of blooming flowers from their neighbor's garden. Friends, family members, and a few neighbors had gathered, chatting and laughing as they enjoyed the food and the idyllic setting. For Jason, this moment was more than just a simple gathering. After years of long hours at the police department, working his way up the ranks to become a captain, he had finally achieved his dream of buying a house in a safe, quiet neighborhood where his children could grow up free from the worries that had plagued his own childhood. Moving to Oakdale Heights felt like a reward for his dedication and resilience, a promise to himself and his family that they would have the life he'd always dreamed of. Lisa walked over to Jason, her face beaming as she handed him a glass of lemonade. "Look at this," she said, glancing around at their guests with a look of pride. "It feels like a dream, doesn't it?" Jason nodded, his face breaking into a smile as he took a sip. "It really does. I never thought we'd be here, Lisa. We worked so hard, and now, this is ours." They shared a quiet moment, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. But as they turned back to their guests, enjoying the laughter and camaraderie, they were unaware of a pair of watchful eyes lurking just a few houses down. Mrs. Margaret Caldwell, a longtime resident of Oakdale Heights, stood by her window, her face twisted into a scowl as she watched the gathering unfold in the Parkers' backyard. In her late 60s, Mrs. Caldwell had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 40 years, long enough to see the community change and evolve. But to her, the Parkers were the most unsettling change of all. From the moment she had seen the moving truck pull up in front of the Parkers' house, Mrs. Caldwell's mind had been made up. She didn't need to meet Jason or Lisa to know she didn't want them in her neighborhood. The sight of their family, laughing and mingling in the backyard, only fueled her disdain. "They think they can just move in and turn this place upside down," she muttered to herself, clutching the curtain tightly. "This is a quiet, respectable neighborhood. We don't need all that noise and chaos." As the Parkers' friends and family arrived, Mrs. Caldwell's irritation turned to anger. She counted each car that parked along the curb, each new arrival feeling like an invasion of her world. The laughter of children, the smell of barbecue, the faint sound of music, all of it grated on her nerves, amplifying her resentment. Determined to put an end to what she saw as a disruption to her peaceful street, Mrs. Caldwell stormed into her kitchen and picked up her phone. With a practiced tone of authority, she dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance," she said, her voice clipped and disapproving. "There's a large group of people having a loud party in my neighborhood. It looks like it could get out of hand. You need to send someone over to check it out." The dispatcher assured her that an officer would be dispatched shortly. Satisfied, Mrs. Caldwell hung up the phone and returned to her window, a smug smile creeping across her face. "That'll teach them," she muttered, retreating into the quiet, orderly comfort of her living room. Back at the barbecue, Jason was oblivious to the storm brewing just a few houses away. He handed a plate of ribs to one of his friends, laughing as they swapped stories from their days on the police force. For him, this barbecue was more than just a gathering. It was a celebration of everything he and Lisa had worked for, a way to connect with new neighbors and build a sense of community. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Jason glanced at Lisa, who was helping Zoe dry off after a wild water balloon fight with Marcus. He felt a deep sense of pride, watching his family enjoy the home they had dreamed of for so long. But as he turned back to the grill, something caught his eye. A police car slowly pulling up to the curb in front of his house. The sight of the vehicle caused the relaxed atmosphere to shift. Conversations quieted, and heads turned to watch as the officer stepped out of the car and began walking up the driveway. Jason's heart sank for a moment, though he kept his composure. Years of training had taught him how to remain calm under pressure, but the sight of a fellow officer responding to a complaint at his own home felt like a betrayal. Wiping his hands on a towel, Jason set down the spatula and walked toward the front yard, ready to handle whatever was about to unfold. As he approached the officer, he recognized him. A young man named Officer Brooks, who had joined the force only a few months ago. Jason had mentored him briefly during his training, and he could see the discomfort in the younger man's face. "Good afternoon, sir," Officer Brooks said, his voice calm and professional. "We received a noise complaint about a gathering that might be getting out of hand. I just need to check things out." Jason nodded, maintaining a polite smile. "No problem, officer. We're just having a small family barbecue. Everything's under control here," he replied, gesturing toward the backyard, where the children were playing and guests were chatting peacefully. There was no hint of the chaos that Mrs. Caldwell had implied. Before Officer Brooks could respond, a shrill voice cut through the air. "That's them. That's the family causing all the noise." Mrs. Caldwell had emerged from her house, striding toward them with an expression of pure disapproval. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her gaze was fixed on Jason and his family, as if they were intruders. Jason clenched his jaw but remained silent, standing tall as he faced her judgmental stare. This wasn't his first encounter with someone like Mrs. Caldwell, but it didn't make the situation any easier. He knew exactly what she thought of him and his family, and he felt the weight of her disdain pressing down on him. As Mrs. Caldwell closed the distance, the tension in the air became palpable. Conversations in the backyard hushed to whispers, and all eyes turned toward the unfolding scene. Officer Brooks, visibly uncomfortable, glanced between Mrs. Caldwell and Jason, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. "Ma'am," Officer Brooks began, trying to regain control, "I understand you've made a complaint, but everything seems peaceful here. There doesn't appear to be any disturbance." "Peaceful?" Mrs. Caldwell snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. "There's loud music, too many people, and children running wild. This is a quiet neighborhood. We don't need this kind of chaos. These people," she paused, casting a deliberate, disdainful look at Jason and his guests, "are disturbing the peace." Jason clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he held his temper in check. He had encountered people like Mrs. Caldwell before, people who saw him and his family as a disruption simply because they didn't fit their narrow vision of who belonged in Oakdale Heights. Taking a deep breath, he reminded himself to stay calm. "Officer," Jason said, his voice steady, "as you can see, this is a family gathering. We're not causing any harm, and the music isn't loud enough to disturb anyone beyond a few houses. I've had plenty of barbecues like this in other neighborhoods without a single issue." His words hung in the air, and the meaning behind them wasn't lost on Officer Brooks or the guests. Jason wasn't just addressing the complaint. He was calling out the underlying prejudice, the double standard that judged him and his family more harshly than others. Officer Brooks cleared his throat, clearly caught between his duty and the tension surrounding him. "Sir," he said, addressing Jason directly, "it does seem that everything is in order here. I'll write a report, but there doesn't seem to be any need for further action. A wave of relief washed over the guests, and conversations began to pick up again. But Mrs. Caldwell wasn't satisfied. Her face twisted in frustration, and she took a step closer to the officer, her voice rising. "You're just going to let them continue. This is a respectable neighborhood. We don't need large, disruptive parties here. Why can't they just—" "Ma'am," Jason interrupted, his voice calm but firm, stepping forward and putting himself between Mrs. Caldwell and Officer Brooks. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her falter. "We are your neighbors. We're having a family barbecue, just like anyone else would. We're not going anywhere." In that moment, Jason's voice wasn't just a defense. It was a declaration of belonging. He was telling Mrs. Caldwell, and everyone else who might be watching, that his family had earned their place here, and they would not be intimidated. Mrs. Caldwell took a shaky breath, her face red with anger and embarrassment. She glanced at Officer Brooks, who gave a slight nod, signaling that he agreed with Jason. Without another word, she turned and marched back to her house, leaving behind the uncomfortable silence she had created. As the police car pulled away and Mrs. Caldwell disappeared behind her door, Jason took a deep breath, letting the tension in his shoulders relax. He looked at Lisa, who had come to stand beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You handled that perfectly," she whispered, pride evident in her eyes. Jason nodded, but as he glanced back toward Mrs. Caldwell's house, he knew this wouldn't be the last time they faced her disapproval. The fight to belong in Oakdale Heights had only just begun. The ripples begin. In the days following the tense confrontation at the barbecue, the Parker family felt a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere of Oakdale Heights. The warm, welcoming facade of their new neighborhood had cooled, revealing a hidden layer of tension lurking beneath the manicured lawns and white picket fences. It was as if an invisible boundary had been drawn around their home, marking them as outsiders in a place where they were supposed to find acceptance. Jason and Lisa tried their best to carry on with life as usual, hoping that the incident with Mrs. Caldwell would soon be forgotten. But Oakdale Heights had its own way of holding on to grudges, particularly when they were fed by whispers and speculation. The barbecue incident became a topic of quiet conversation among the neighbors, each retelling of the story laced with hints of disapproval, skepticism, or outright disdain. The first sign of trouble came one morning as Jason was heading out to work. As a police captain, he often left the house early, dressed sharply in his uniform, with a sense of pride that came from years of dedication to his career. But as he approached his car, parked on the curb outside their home, he noticed something unusual. The thin, neatly folded piece of paper was tucked under his windshield wiper. He frowned, pulling it free and unfolding it. The note was handwritten in neat, careful letters, but the words themselves were anything but friendly. "Oakdale Heights is a quiet community. We don't want trouble here. Keep it down, or find somewhere else to live." Jason felt a surge of anger rise within him, his hands tightening around the paper. He'd dealt with racism and prejudice before, both subtle and overt, but seeing it here, in front of his own home, left him with a bitter taste in his mouth. This wasn't the life he promised his family, a life of respect, stability, and acceptance. He had moved them to Oakdale Heights precisely because he thought it would be different, a place where they could thrive without facing the ugly prejudices he fought against his entire life. Taking a deep breath, Jason folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't want to worry Lisa or the kids, but he knew he couldn't ignore this. This wasn't just about noise complaints or a simple misunderstanding. This was something deeper, something that wouldn't be solved with a polite conversation. Later that day, while he was at work, Jason couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He knew he'd need to talk to Lisa about the note, but he wasn't sure how to approach it. The last thing he wanted was for her to feel unsafe in their new home. They'd fought too hard to get here, and he couldn't bear the thought of them feeling unwelcome. Meanwhile, Lisa had her own encounters with the neighborhood's chilly reception. She'd always been the kind of person who made friends easily, a natural at striking up conversations and finding common ground with anyone she met. So when she'd first moved into Oakdale Heights, she'd looked forward to building connections with her new neighbors, imagining friendly coffee dates and play dates for the kids. But since the barbecue, she noticed that people seemed to avoid eye contact when she walked down the street. The friendly waves and casual conversations she'd expected were replaced by polite but distant nods, as if people were trying to keep her at arm's length. Even at the grocery store, she caught sidelong glances from a few familiar faces, whispers shared behind hands, as if she were the subject of a story they all knew but wouldn't dare tell her. One afternoon, as she was picking up Zoe and Marcus from school, she overheard two mothers standing by the entrance, speaking in low voices but loud enough for her to hear. "Did you hear about the new family on Maple Street?" One of the women whispered, her tone dripping with judgment. "I heard they had a party so wild that the police had to come break it up." The other mother gasped, her eyes widening. "No way. That's not the kind of thing we want in Oakdale Heights. This is supposed to be a nice, quiet neighborhood." Lisa's stomach twisted as she listened to them, her hand instinctively reaching for Zoe's as they walked by. She wanted to turn around, to confront them, and set the record straight, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. These weren't misunderstandings that could be cleared up with a friendly chat. This was prejudice, plain and simple. As they walked back to the car, Zoe looked up at her mother, her eyes filled with innocent curiosity. "Mom, why were those ladies looking at us funny?" she asked, her voice small. Lisa forced a smile, squeezing her daughter's hand gently. "Sometimes people don't understand things they don't know, sweetheart. But that doesn't mean we should let it bother us. We know who we are, and that's what matters." Zoe nodded, seeming to accept her mother's explanation, but Lisa couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. This wasn't the life she'd envisioned for her children, a life where they'd have to endure the same biases and judgments that she and Jason had fought so hard to overcome. That evening, as Jason returned home, Lisa could sense that he was carrying a weight of his own. They sat together at the kitchen table after the kids had gone to bed, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Jason reached into his pocket, pulling out the folded note and sliding it across the table to Lisa. She picked it up, her brow furrowing as she read the words. Her face fell, and for a moment, the strength she'd held onto all day seemed to waver. She looked up at Jason, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "They left this on your car?" she asked quietly. Jason nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah, I didn't want to show it to you, but we need to be on the same page about what we're dealing with here." Lisa set the note down, her hand resting on top of it, as if she could somehow shield them from the words. "I knew people were talking, but I didn't realize. Jason, this is more than just a few whispers. They don't want us here." Jason reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I know, but we're not going anywhere. We worked too hard for this, Lisa. We deserve to be here just as much as anyone else." She nodded, squeezing his hand. "I just hate that this is happening. We came here to give the kids a better life, and instead, they're being judged before people even know us." Jason's jaw tightened, a fierce determination filling his eyes. "Then we'll show them. We'll show them exactly who we are. We're not here to make trouble, but we're not going to let anyone intimidate us either." In the days that followed, the Parkers continued to face small, subtle reminders of their unwelcome status. Their trash cans were mysteriously knocked over more often than not, even on calm days with no wind. Flyers from the Oakdale Heights Neighborhood Association were left on their doorstep, outlining the community's expectations for noise levels, cleanliness, and respect for neighborhood harmony. While the flyers were standard, the timing of their arrival felt like a targeted message. Lisa tried to brush it off, telling herself that it was just coincidence, but deep down she knew better. This wasn't about following rules or keeping the peace. This was about making them feel like intruders in a place they had every right to call home. One Friday evening, As Jason was finishing up paperwork at the precinct, his phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "You won't believe what just happened. Mrs. Caldwell is at it again. She's at the park, talking to people, saying we're trouble." Jason's blood boiled as he read the message. He quickly wrapped up his work and headed home, his mind racing. He'd expected Mrs. Caldwell to hold a grudge after the barbecue incident, but he hadn't realized how far she'd go to turn the community against them. When he arrived home, he found Lisa sitting on the porch, watching Zoe and Marcus play in the yard. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the lawn, and for a moment, everything looked perfect, just as it had the day they moved in. But the peace of the scene was marred by the frustration etched on Lisa's face. "What did she say this time?" Jason asked as he sat down beside her. Lisa sighed, her shoulders slumping. "She's been telling everyone at the park that we're causing trouble, that we're bringing down the neighborhood. She didn't say anything outright, but she made it clear she doesn't think we belong here." Jason clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "We've done nothing wrong, Lisa. We have every right to be here. I don't care what she thinks." "I know," Lisa replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "But it's not just her anymore. I can feel it when I walk down the street, when I pick up the kids from school. People are looking at us differently. They're keeping their distance." Jason looked out at their children, running and laughing in the yard, blissfully unaware of the struggles their parents were facing. He knew that he had to fight, not just for himself and Lisa, but for Zoe and Marcus. They deserved a safe, welcoming place to grow up, and he wasn't going to let Mrs. Caldwell or anyone else rob them of that. He turned to Lisa, his voice filled with resolve. "We're going to stay strong." Standing their ground. The days stretched on, and the subtle hostility the Parker family faced in Oakdale Heights began to weigh on Jason and Lisa more heavily. Every morning when Jason left for work, he scanned his car for any new notes or marks. Every time Lisa went to the grocery store or picked up the kids from school, she felt the weight of judgmental stares, the whispers, the looks that seemed to suggest they didn't belong. It was exhausting, and no amount of reminding themselves why they'd moved here seemed to shake the constant feeling of being watched. But despite everything, the Parkers refused to let themselves be intimidated. They went about their lives with quiet determination, unwilling to bend or yield to the undercurrent of hostility that had infected their new neighborhood. They held family dinners, invited friends over, and spent their weekends doing yard work or playing with Zoe and Marcus. They were determined to make their presence known, not as troublemakers or outliers, but as a family with as much right to be there as anyone else. One Saturday morning, Jason and Lisa were outside, working together to plant new flowers along the walkway leading to their front door. The vibrant colors were Lisa's idea, a way to add a touch of warmth and beauty to their home, a small symbol of hope amidst the challenges they were facing. As she dug into the soil, her hands covered in dirt, she looked up at Jason with a smile, a reminder of the joy they shared despite everything. Across the street, Mrs. Caldwell stood at her window, watching them with a look of disapproval. Jason noticed her out of the corner of his eye, but he refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, shoveling dirt and arranging the flowers just as Lisa liked them. As they worked, a car pulled up in front of their house, and a familiar face stepped out. It was Tom, one of Jason's colleagues from the police force, a good-natured man with a hearty laugh who'd always supported Jason during his rise through the ranks. He waved as he approached, carrying a box filled with tools and supplies. "Morning, Parker family," Tom greeted them, setting the box down and wiping his brow. "Thought I'd stop by and help you get this garden in shape." Jason grinned, giving his friend a firm handshake. "Thanks, Tom. You didn't have to, but I appreciate it." Lisa smiled warmly, feeling a sense of relief at having an ally in their space. "Thank you, Tom. It's good to see a friendly face around here." As the three of them worked together, chatting and laughing, the atmosphere began to feel lighter. Tom's presence brought a much-needed dose of normalcy, a reminder that not everyone in Oakdale Heights was like Mrs. Caldwell or the neighbors who kept their distance. But as they laughed and joked, they couldn't help but notice that Mrs. Caldwell's curtains remained firmly drawn, her disapproving stare piercing through the glass. Halfway through planting the last batch of flowers, Jason saw a group of neighbors gather across the street, talking in hushed tones and glancing in their direction. He recognized a few of them from previous encounters. People who had once smiled and waved, but who now looked at them with thinly veiled suspicion. Tom noticed the group as well and let out a low chuckle. "Seems like you've got quite the fan club, Jason," he said with a wry grin. Jason shook his head, his face hardening. "More like a fan club that doesn't want us here." Tom's smile faded, and he placed a reassuring hand on Jason's shoulder. "Hey, don't let them get to you. People are going to talk, especially when they're scared of change. But they don't know you like I do. You're a good man, and they'll see that eventually." Lisa nodded, her gaze steady. "We didn't come here to hide. We're not going to change who we are just to make them comfortable." Jason smiled at his wife, grateful for her strength. Together, they finished planting the flowers, their determination reinforced by the silent message they were sending to the neighborhood. They weren't going anywhere. As the day wore on, the Parker family continued with their weekend routine. Zoe and Marcus played in the backyard, while Jason and Tom set up a small table and chairs, planning to enjoy a quiet afternoon barbecue. The rich aroma of seasoned ribs and grilled vegetables wafted through the air, filling their yard with a sense of home. But as the food sizzled on the grill, they heard footsteps approaching. Jason turned to see Mrs. Caldwell, accompanied by two other neighbors, crossing the street toward their house. Her face was set in a look of steely resolve, and the others mirrored her expression, their arms crossed as they marched purposefully up the driveway. Jason's jaw tightened, but he kept his face neutral, determined not to let her provoke him. He exchanged a quick glance with Lisa, who set down the salad bowl she'd been holding, her own expression hardening in anticipation of the confrontation. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Caldwell." Jason greeted her calmly, keeping his voice steady. "What can I do for you?" Mrs. Caldwell stopped a few feet from him, her gaze flicking over the barbecue setup and the sight of Tom, who was watching the scene unfold with a bemused expression. She lifted her chin, her tone icy. "We need to have a word, Mr. Parker," she began, her voice laced with disdain. "Several of us in the neighborhood are concerned about the way things have been since you moved in. We like things a certain way around here, and we don't appreciate disturbances." "Disturbances," Jason repeated, his eyebrows raising. "All we're doing is having a family barbecue." "Yes, but that's not the point," one of the neighbors chimed in, his voice filled with irritation. "It's the noise, the extra cars, the activity. This is a quiet neighborhood." Jason kept his composure, though his patience was wearing thin. "With all due respect, we're not doing anything different than any other family would. We're just enjoying our home, just like you do." Mrs. Caldwell crossed her arms, her lips pursed tightly. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Parker. We have standards here in Oakdale Heights. We don't want this place turning into, well, let's just say, we don't want any issues." The implication in her words was clear, and Jason felt a surge of anger rise within him. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before responding. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his voice calm but firm, "my family and I moved here for the same reasons you did. We want a safe, peaceful place to raise our children. We're not here to cause trouble, but we also won't be made to feel like we don't belong. We have every right to be here." One of the other neighbors, a woman with graying hair, spoke up, her voice sharp. "But you need to understand that Oakdale Heights has a reputation. We don't want that reputation damaged by unnecessary disruptions." Jason felt his hands clench into fists, but he forced himself to stay composed. "A reputation," he echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. "My family isn't here to harm your reputation. We're here to live our lives, just like everyone else." At that moment, Tom stepped forward, his expression serious as he addressed the group. "Jason's right. I've known him for years, and he's one of the most honorable people I have ever met. He's worked hard to be here, and he's earned every bit of it. If you're worried about Oakdale Heights' reputation, maybe you should be more concerned about how you're treating a family that's done nothing wrong." The neighbors shifted uncomfortably, casting glances at one another. Mrs. Caldwell's face turned red, and her mouth tightened in a thin line. She hadn't expected resistance, especially not from someone like Tom, who was well respected in the community. After a long, tense silence, Mrs. Caldwell huffed, turning on her heel. "Well, we'll see about that," she muttered, her voice dripping with contempt. She and her companions walked away, murmuring among themselves as they crossed back to their side of the street. Jason watched them go, his shoulders tense. He could feel the weight of the confrontation settling over him, but he was determined not to let it break him. He looked over at Tom, who gave him a supportive nod, and then at Lisa, who reached out to squeeze his hand. "You did the right thing," Lisa said softly, her voice filled with pride. "We're not backing down. Not for them, not for anyone." Jason nodded, a sense of resolve hardening within him. "They can try to intimidate us all they want, but we're not going anywhere." As they sat down to eat, the tension from the confrontation gradually faded, replaced by a renewed sense of unity. This wasn't just about a barbecue or a few hostile glances. This was about standing up for their right to live peacefully and freely, no matter who tried to tell them otherwise. That night, after their guests had left and the children were tucked into bed, Jason and Lisa sat together on the porch, looking out at the quiet street. The stars sparkled above them, and the air was cool and still. For a moment, everything felt calm, as if the troubles of the day had melted away. But as they sat in the silence, Jason knew this was only the beginning. Mrs. Caldwell and her supporters weren't going to back down easily. He'd faced challenges before, but this was different. This was personal. It was about his family, his home, his right to exist peacefully in a place they had worked so hard to attain. He tightened his grip on Lisa's hand, his heart filled with determination. They would fight this battle together, come what may. Lines drawn. As the weeks went by, the tension between the Parker family and certain members of the Oakdale Heights community intensified, manifesting in small but unmistakable acts of hostility. Little things that might have been dismissed as accidents began to pile up, each one chipping away at the illusion of peace they had once hoped to find here. It started with something as simple as trash. Jason had always been diligent about making sure their trash cans were properly closed and stored, but every morning after trash day, he found their cans overturned, garbage spilling onto the curb. At first, he assumed it was just a stray animal or perhaps the wind, but the frequency of the occurrences became too consistent to ignore. Each Thursday morning, he'd go out to find the same scene. Their trash strewn across the lawn while the other houses' bins remained untouched, neatly lined along the curb. Then there were the flyers. Twice a week, Lisa found herself picking up stacks of neighborhood association flyers from their front porch, each one outlining various community rules about noise levels, lawn maintenance, and respect for neighborhood harmony. It didn't take much to read between the lines. The timing of these reminders left little doubt that they were intended as thinly veiled warnings aimed at their family. One Sunday afternoon, Jason decided to take Zoe and Marcus to the local park for a little fresh air. It was a sunny day with a crisp breeze that rustled the leaves, and he hoped the outing would give his children a chance to feel some sense of normalcy. As they approached the playground, Marcus raced ahead to the swings, his face alight with excitement, while Zoe headed for the monkey bars. Jason smiled, leaning back on a bench to watch them play. For a few minutes, he allowed himself to relax, savoring the sight of his kids laughing, free from the troubles that had consumed their lives lately. But as he sat there, he noticed a familiar figure approaching from across the park. It was Mrs. Caldwell, flanked by two other women who frequently attended the local neighborhood association meetings. The trio was walking in his direction, their eyes fixed on him with that same judgmental gaze he'd come to recognize all too well. Jason's jaw tightened, and he straightened in his seat, bracing himself for whatever they might say. He knew it was unlikely that this encounter would end with pleasantries. "Good afternoon, Mr. Parker," Mrs. Caldwell greeted him, her tone cold and formal. The two other women nodded but remained silent, their expressions mirroring Mrs. Caldwell's disapproval. "Afternoon, Mrs. Caldwell," Jason replied, keeping his voice calm, though he could feel the simmering tension just below the surface. She glanced over at Zoe and Marcus, who were still playing, blissfully unaware of the confrontation brewing nearby. "Lovely day to be out," she said, though her tone lacked any warmth. "We just happened to notice you here and thought we'd address a few concerns we have regarding your family's behavior in our community." Jason felt a pang of irritation but forced himself to stay composed. "I'd be happy to address any concerns you have, Mrs. Caldwell," he replied, keeping his tone steady. Mrs. Caldwell's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, as you might have noticed, Oakdale Heights is a quiet neighborhood, a place where people expect peace and decorum. Unfortunately, since you've moved in, there have been disturbances, noise, gatherings, and other things that don't quite fit the culture we've worked so hard to cultivate here." Jason clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. "I'm not sure I understand what you're implying, Mrs. Caldwell. We've followed all the neighborhood rules, and our gatherings have been respectful and within reasonable limits. We have the same right to enjoy our home as anyone else here." One of the other women, a tall, thin lady with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, finally spoke up, her voice dripping with disdain. "It's not just about following rules, Mr. Parker. It's about fitting in, respecting the traditions and values of this community. There are certain standards that we hold dear, and, well, some of us feel that your presence here is disrupting that balance." Jason's gaze hardened, and he felt the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy shroud. He knew exactly what she meant by standards and values. This wasn't about noise or gatherings. It was about the color of his skin, the quiet discomfort they felt seeing his family in their midst. "Look," Jason said, his voice firm but controlled, "I understand that you might be used to a certain way of life here, but my family has every right to be in this neighborhood. We're hardworking, law-abiding people who just want to raise our kids in a safe, welcoming place. We moved here because we believed Oakdale Heights was that kind of place." Mrs. Caldwell's face twisted into a sneer. "Well, perhaps you were misinformed. We have certain expectations, Mr. Parker, and frankly, if you can't meet them, it might be better for everyone if you considered relocating." A surge of anger flared up in Jason's chest, but he fought to keep his composure. He looked directly into Mrs. Caldwell's eyes, unflinching. "We're not going anywhere, Mrs. Caldwell. My family has a right to be here, just as much as yours or anyone else's. And if you have a problem with that, then maybe it's time you reconsidered your own values." The women shifted uncomfortably, clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to so directly. Mrs. Caldwell's face reddened, and she took a step back, her composure momentarily faltering. "Very well," she said, her tone icy, "but don't say we didn't warn you. Oakdale Heights isn't the kind of place that tolerates disruptions." With that, she turned and walked away, her friends following close behind. Jason watched them go, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and defiance. He glanced over at his children, who were still laughing and playing, blissfully unaware of the confrontation that had just taken place. Later that evening, Jason shared the encounter with Lisa as they sat together in the living room, their voices low so as not to disturb the kids, who were watching a movie in the other room. Lisa listened intently, her face growing more serious with each word. "They actually told you we should consider leaving?" she asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. Jason nodded, his jaw clenched. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore. They don't want us here. and they're willing to do whatever it takes to make us uncomfortable enough to leave." Lisa's eyes flashed with anger. "This is unbelievable. We moved here to give our kids a better life, to be part of a community, not to be treated like intruders. I refuse to let them push us out." Jason took her hand, his own resolve hardening. "I know. We've worked too hard to let anyone scare us away. But it's clear that this isn't going to be easy. They're not going to stop." Lisa nodded, a look of determination settling over her face. "Then we won't stop either. We'll keep doing what we're doing, showing them that we belong here just as much as they do. And if they want to keep making it hard for us, then so be it. We're stronger than they realize." The next day, Jason and Lisa decided to take a bold step. They began reaching out to other neighbors, inviting them over for coffee or casual chats, hoping to show them who they truly were beyond the whispers and rumors that Mrs. Caldwell had spread. Some of the neighbors accepted their invitations, albeit cautiously, and as they got to know the Parkers, many of them seemed to warm up, realizing that the family was nothing like the image Mrs. Caldwell had painted. One particular neighbor, a young mother named Rachel, became an unexpected ally. She lived a few houses down and had 2 young children who often played with Zoe and Marcus at the park. After one of these playdates, Rachel approached Lisa with a look of understanding. "I just wanted to say," Rachel began, her voice soft but sincere, "I know things have been rough for you here. And I'm sorry. Not everyone feels the way Mrs. Caldwell does. Some of us are glad to have you here." Lisa felt a wave of gratitude and relief wash over her, and she reached out to squeeze Rachel's hand. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Rachel smiled, nodding. "I can't speak for everyone, but I think if people just took the time to get to know you, they'd realize that you're a great addition to this neighborhood." As Rachel left, Lisa felt a renewed sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find their place here, despite Mrs. Caldwell's efforts to undermine them. She shared the encounter with Jason, and for the first time in weeks, they felt a glimmer of optimism. But Mrs. Caldwell was not one to be deterred. As the Parkers slowly began to forge connections with a few open-minded neighbors, she saw her influence waning. She doubled down, spreading more rumors and warning anyone who would listen about the trouble that the Parkers would bring to their beloved Oakdale Heights. The stakes had been raised, and Jason and Lisa knew they were in for a long battle. But with each small victory, each neighbor who smiled at them, each child who played with Zoe and Marcus, they found the strength to keep going. They weren't just fighting for their right to live in Oakdale Heights. They were fighting for their dignity, their family, and their future. They were here to stay, and they would face whatever came their way together. Unyielding resolve. The strain of Mrs. Caldwell's relentless campaign against the Parker family was starting to show. Each new rumor she spread, each whispered insinuation, only served to isolate Jason and Lisa further. The tension in Oakdale Heights was palpable, like a coiled spring ready to snap. But if Mrs. Caldwell thought her efforts would wear them down, she was sorely mistaken. Jason and Lisa were more determined than ever to assert their right to live in peace, no matter how uncomfortable it made her or anyone else in the neighborhood. But the pressure wasn't easy to ignore. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Jason noticed that Zoe and Marcus were unusually quiet, pushing their food around on their plates. Normally, dinner time was filled with their laughter and stories from the day, but tonight, their faces were solemn, their eyes downcast. "Is everything okay, kids?" Jason asked, trying to keep his tone light. Zoe glanced at her younger brother, then back at her father. Her voice was small and hesitant. "Some of the kids at school. They won't play with us anymore." Lisa's fork clattered onto her plate, her face going pale. She reached across the table, resting her hand on Zoe's. "Why, sweetheart?" Zoe's gaze dropped to her plate. They said their parents told them to stay away from us. That we're not like them." Marcus, still too young to fully understand the situation, nodded solemnly, his little face crunched up in confusion. "They don't want to play with us because of Mrs. Caldwell." Jason felt a surge of anger, his fists clenching under the table. He had expected Mrs. Caldwell's influence to affect his own interactions with the neighborhood, but to hear that her poison had seeped down to his children, affecting their friendships, their innocence, made his blood boil. Lisa's voice was filled with quiet fury as she spoke. "This has gone too far, Jason. Our kids are being targeted now. This isn't just about us. It's about their childhood, their happiness." Jason took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew that if he didn't keep his anger in check, he'd only be giving Mrs. Caldwell exactly what she wanted, a reason to paint him as the angry outsider she'd been portraying all along. But he was also done playing by her rules. It was time to take a stand. "We can't let her win, Lisa," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We've been trying to ignore her, hoping she'd back off, but it's clear she won't stop until we're gone. We need to show her that we're not going anywhere, and that we won't let her or anyone else make our children feel like they don't belong." Lisa nodded, her jaw set in determination. "You're right. We've tried being polite. We've tried reaching out. But maybe it's time we show her and everyone else exactly who we are and what we stand for." The next day, Jason decided to take a more proactive approach. He started by meeting with the principal at Zoe and Marcus's school, explaining the situation and his concerns about the way some of the other children were treating his kids. The principal, a kind woman named Ms. Albright, listened attentively, her brow furrowing as she took in Jason's words. "I'm so sorry to hear that your children have been going through this, Mr. Parker," she said, her voice filled with genuine empathy. "This kind of behavior has no place in our school, and I'll make sure to address it with the staff and the students. We want every child here to feel safe and welcome." Jason felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had an ally, someone who understood and cared about what his family was going through. He thanked Ms. Albright, feeling a renewed sense of hope as he left the school. But he wasn't done yet. That evening, he and Lisa made a plan to host a community gathering at their home. It would be a small, casual event, coffee, tea, and light snacks, but they intended to use it as an opportunity to reach out to their neighbors, to show them who they were beyond Mrs. Caldwell's vicious rumors. They would invite everyone in Oakdale Heights, even those who had avoided them, in the hopes that a few might be willing to see past their prejudices. Lisa crafted a warm invitation and printed copies for every household. She spent the next afternoon delivering them personally, knocking on doors and handing the invites to whoever answered. Some people accepted them with polite but distant smiles. Others offered curt nods and closed their doors without a word. But Lisa remained undeterred, her resolve growing stronger with each step. When she reached Mrs. Caldwell's house, Lisa took a deep breath, her hand tightening around the last invitation. She knew there was no way Mrs. Caldwell would come, but she wanted to make it clear that the Parkers were here to stay, and that they would not be intimidated. Mrs. Caldwell opened the door, her face twisting into a scowl as soon as she saw Lisa. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice as cold as ever. Lisa held out the invitation, her expression calm but unyielding. "We're hosting a gathering at our house tomorrow evening. You're welcome to join us, Mrs. Caldwell. It's a chance to get to know us better, maybe clear up some of the misunderstandings that seem to have come up." Mrs. Caldwell scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. "I have no interest in getting to know you or your family, Mrs. Parker. And frankly, I don't think anyone else does either." Lisa's smile didn't falter. "That's your choice. But I thought it was important to extend the invitation anyway. We're part of this neighborhood, and we're not going anywhere." With that, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding, but her head held high. She had no idea if their plan would work, but she was proud of the stand they were taking. They were no longer waiting for acceptance. They were demanding it. The following evening, as the sun began to set, Jason and Lisa set up tables in their backyard, arranging an assortment of snacks and drinks. They decorated the space with string lights and set out chairs, creating a warm, inviting atmosphere. Zoe and Marcus helped by putting out cups and napkins, their excitement shining through despite the recent challenges they'd faced. At 6 o'clock, the first guests began to arrive. Rachel, the young mother who had befriended Lisa, showed up with her husband and 2 kids, bringing a plate of homemade cookies. She greeted them with a warm smile, expressing her support and excitement for the gathering. Soon after, a few more families trickled in. Some of them neighbors who had been distant but polite, others who had previously avoided the Parkers altogether. Jason and Lisa greeted each guest with kindness and warmth, making small talk and introducing them to their children. They shared stories about their lives, their work, their dreams for their family, hoping to dispel the misconceptions that had taken root. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere began to lighten. People started to relax, laughing and chatting as they got to know the Parkers. Jason shared stories from his career, talking about the challenges and rewards of being a police captain, while Lisa talked about her passion for art and her plans to open a small gallery in the city. Zoe and Marcus played with the other kids, their laughter filling the yard, as they chased each other under the twinkling lights. But not everyone was won over so easily. Jason noticed a small group of neighbors standing off to the side, their expressions skeptical and their arms crossed as they whispered among themselves. He recognized some of them from previous encounters, people who had sided with Mrs. Caldwell, who had bought into her narrative without question. He knew they wouldn't be easy to sway, but he was determined to try. At one point, he approached them, offering a friendly smile. "I'm glad you could make it," he said, his tone open and genuine. "I know there's been some misunderstanding since we moved here, and I'd like to clear the air if I can." One of the men, a middle-aged guy with graying hair and a skeptical gaze, shrugged. "It's not personal, Parker. People just like things the way they are. This is a quiet neighborhood, and some folks don't like, well, disruptions." Jason nodded, understanding the coded language all too well. "I get it. Change can be uncomfortable, but we're just here to live our lives, like anyone else. We want to be part of this community, not disrupt it." The man hesitated, glancing at his friends before nodding slowly. "Well, maybe we've been a bit quick to judge. I'll think about it." As the evening wound down, Jason and Lisa looked around at the group gathered in their backyard, feeling a sense of accomplishment. They hadn't won everyone over. There would always be those who clung to their prejudices, who refused to see past the surface. But they had made progress, and for the first time in weeks, they felt a sense of belonging. After the guests had left, Jason and Lisa sat together on the porch, watching the lights twinkle in the quiet night. They were exhausted, but their spirits were lifted, their hope renewed. They had shown Oakdale Heights who they truly were, and while it might take time, they knew they had started to carve out their place in this community. But they also knew that Mrs. Caldwell wasn't done. She hadn't attended the gathering, and they had no doubt that she would continue her campaign against them. Still, as they sat together, hand in hand, Jason and Lisa felt ready to face whatever came next. They weren't just surviving in Oakdale Heights. They were thriving, and they would continue to do so, no matter who tried to stand in their way. The turning tide. As dawn broke over Oakdale Heights the morning after the community gathering, Jason and Lisa Parker felt a new sense of calm. They had done everything within their power to build bridges, extending an olive branch to their neighbors and showing the community who they truly were. The previous night's gathering had felt like a small victory, a glimmer of hope in an otherwise trying journey. They knew it hadn't changed everyone's minds, but they felt, for the first time, that they had allies in this neighborhood, people who had looked past the rumors and prejudice to see their family for who they really were. But even as they clung to this new optimism, Jason knew the battle wasn't over. He'd noticed Mrs. Caldwell's curtains twitching as guests arrived and left the previous evening, and he had no doubt she was more determined than ever to drive them out. Her refusal to engage with the Parkers only confirmed her intent to push them away. Later that afternoon, as Jason was putting away the last of the folding chairs from the backyard, he noticed a police car slowly driving down their street. At first, he thought it was just a routine patrol, but as the car rolled to a stop in front of their house, his stomach tightened. He recognized the officer stepping out of the car. Officer Brooks, the same young man who had responded to Mrs. Caldwell's complaint during their first barbecue. Jason nodded at the officer, feeling a wave of irritation that he quickly pushed down. He wasn't about to let this man, or anyone else, see that Mrs. Caldwell's efforts were getting to him. "Afternoon, Officer Brooks," Jason greeted, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Is there something I can help you with?" Officer Brooks looked uncomfortable, glancing around as if trying to avoid the eyes of any neighbors who might be watching. "Mr. Parker, I'm here because we received another complaint from Mrs. Caldwell. She said there's been excessive noise, disturbances, and unusual activity around your home." Jason felt his patience wearing thin. "Officer Brooks, you were here last time and saw for yourself that we were doing nothing wrong. We've been respectful, quiet, and have followed every community rule. If there's a real problem, I'd like to know what it is." The young officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between his duty and his personal feelings. "Look, Mr. Parker," he said, lowering his voice, "I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think there's any real issue here, but Mrs. Caldwell has influence in this town. She's called in several complaints, and, well, it's putting pressure on the department to respond, even though I don't think it's necessary." Jason's jaw tightened. It was infuriating to think that Mrs. Caldwell's unfounded complaints could be taken seriously simply because of her social standing. But he also saw the opportunity in Officer Brooks's words, a chance to finally address the issue directly with the police, to make it clear that he wasn't going to be intimidated or harassed. "Officer Brooks," Jason said firmly, "I respect that you have a job to do, but I'm not going to stand by and let my family be harassed because of one person's prejudice. We've done nothing wrong. If Mrs. Caldwell has a legitimate complaint, I'm more than willing to discuss it. But if she's simply using her influence to target us, then I'd like to speak to someone higher up in the department." Officer Brooks nodded, clearly relieved by Jason's directness. "I understand, Mr. Parker. I'll speak to my supervisor and make sure they're aware of the situation. To be honest, I don't think you're the first family to have issues with Mrs. Caldwell. She has a reputation for causing trouble." Jason appreciated the officer's candor and thanked him for his honesty. As Officer Brooks drove away, Jason felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't alone in this. There were people, even within the police force, who saw Mrs. Caldwell for who she was and recognized the unfairness of her actions. He knew it was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. Later that evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Jason shared the conversation with Lisa. She listened intently, her face shifting from concern to determination as he explained what Officer Brooks had said. "It's good to know that people are starting to see through her," Lisa said, "but I still worry. She's not going to stop. If anything, this will only make her more determined." Jason nodded. "I know. But we're not going to back down, Lisa. We've shown the community who we are, and if we have to fight to stay here, then so be it. We've faced worse." Over the next few weeks, the Parkers continued to go about their lives, refusing to let Mrs. Caldwell's hostility dampen their spirits. Zoe and Marcus started making new friends at school, with more children willing to play with them as their parents softened toward the Parker family. Rachel, their supportive neighbor, began organizing playdates with her kids and the Parker children, solidifying a budding friendship that provided a much-needed sense of connection and community. One Saturday, as Lisa was chatting with Rachel in the front yard, they noticed a group of neighbors gathering on the sidewalk, whispering among themselves and glancing toward the Parkers' house. At first, Lisa assumed it was just another instance of curious eyes watching their every move, but soon she noticed something unusual. One of the women, a petite, elderly lady named Mrs. Jenkins, broke away from the group and approached them. Mrs. Jenkins had always been polite but distant, never engaging beyond a quick nod of acknowledgement. But today, her face held a look of remorse, her steps hesitant yet resolute. "Mrs. Parker, may I speak with you for a moment?" she asked, her voice gentle but tinged with guilt. Lisa exchanged a quick glance with Rachel, then nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Jenkins." The older woman sighed, glancing back at the group of neighbors before meeting Lisa's eyes. "I wanted to apologize. I may have let Mrs. Caldwell's words influence me more than they should have. She has a way of making people see things her way. But after your gathering and seeing how you and your family truly are, I realized I was wrong to judge you so quickly." Lisa felt a warmth spread through her chest, relief mingling with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. That means a lot to us. We just want to be part of this community, like anyone else." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her expression softening. "I know. And I think others are starting to see that too. Mrs. Caldwell, she may be loud, but she doesn't speak for all of us." As Mrs. Jenkins walked back to the group, a few others offered tentative waves and nods, subtle but significant gestures that spoke volumes. It was clear that Mrs. Caldwell's influence was beginning to wane. People were starting to see her for who she was, and more importantly, they were beginning to see the Parkers for who they truly were. But as Jason and Lisa soon discovered, Mrs. Caldwell wasn't one to back down quietly. A week later, just as they were beginning to feel settled, Jason came home from work to find Lisa standing on the front porch, a worried look on her face. "There's something you need to see," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She led him around to the side of the house, where someone had spray-painted a message in large, angry red letters. "Go back to where you came from." Jason felt a wave of rage surge through him, but he forced himself to take a deep breath, clenching his fists as he processed the words. This was no longer just whispers or passive-aggressive notes. This was an outright attack, a threat designed to scare them, to make them feel unsafe in their own home. Lisa's voice trembled as she spoke. "This has gone too far, Jason. We need to take action." Jason nodded, his face set in grim determination. "I'm done being quiet about this. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about standing up to people like Mrs. Caldwell, who think they can push people out just because they don't look like everyone else." They called the police, filing a report and documenting the vandalism. Officer Brooks arrived within minutes, his expression darkening as he took in the sight of the graffiti. "This is unacceptable," he muttered, shaking his head. "We're going to investigate this, Mr. Parker. And I'll make sure my supervisor knows exactly what's been happening here." As Officer Brooks took their statements, several neighbors began to gather, drawn by the sight of the police car, and the sound of murmurs spreading down the block. Among them was Rachel, who looked horrified as she saw the spray-painted message. "This is disgusting," she said, her voice filled with anger. "No one should have to deal with this, especially not in a place like Oakdale Heights. I'm so sorry this happened to you." One by one, other neighbors began to express their outrage, their voices joining in solidarity. Mrs. Jenkins approached, her face pale with shock. "This isn't who we are," she said firmly. "We won't let one person's hatred define our community." In that moment, Jason and Lisa realized something powerful. The tide had turned. The blatant act of hatred had backfired, exposing the ugliness of Mrs. Caldwell's campaign and galvanizing the community to stand with them rather than against them. In the days that followed, neighbors began to reach out to the Parkers in ways they never had before. They offered their support, stopped by to chat, and even helped clean up the spray paint. The whispers of judgment and disdain were replaced by words of kindness and solidarity. Oakdale Heights was changing, and the Parkers had become a part of that change. As for Mrs. Caldwell, her influence dwindled, her power over the neighborhood eroded by the very hatred she'd sought to spread. She remained in her house, watching from behind her curtains, but her glares and whispers no longer held sway. The community had made their choice. They had chosen unity, acceptance, and resilience over fear and prejudice. On a warm summer evening, Jason and Lisa sat together on their porch, watching Zoe and Marcus play in the yard with their new friends. The air was filled with laughter, the light of the setting sun casting a golden glow over their home. They had faced hostility, endured prejudice, and overcome countless obstacles, but they had emerged stronger, their family and their place in Oakdale Heights secure. They had proven, not only to Mrs. Caldwell, but to the entire neighborhood, that they belonged. And as they sat there, hand in hand, they knew that this was only the beginning of the life they would build here. A life defined not by the hatred of a few, but by the love and acceptance of a community that had finally opened its heart.